Good morning, world history. I forgot to wish it to you yesterday, so happy April. We've made it through the month of March. Um, Today we have a little bit more of a somber topic to talk about. Today we're going to be talking about the Atlantic slave trade. Um, so, the slave trade was a very, very big part of the Americas and of the early history, all the way through really the Civil War, even though it had become illegal by then to be trading slaves. Enslaved Africans, such as the one that your book tells you about on page 487. His name is Olaudah Equiano, and they formed this international trade network that arose in the 1500s. Um, Olaudah Equiano was seized in the 1750s. He was 11 years old. He was living in Nigeria, and he was taken from his village in Nigeria by slave traders. So essentially, he was kidnapped. He was then transported as human cargo from West Africa to the Americas, where ultimately he was bound, he was imprisoned, and he was forced to be a slave for a long time. The Spanish were the first major European partners in the slave trade. They were the ones who started. They bought slaves to labor in Spain's South American empire. As other European powers established colonies in the Americas, the slave trade, and with it the entire international trade network, intensified. And it did so in a pattern that we call triangle trade. We call it triangle trade because it made a triangle. It went from Europe to Africa to the Americas back to Europe. So that creates kind of a triangle shape over the Atlantic Ocean. The people and goods were shipped along triangle trade. It worked in the following way. The first leg, the merchant ships brought European goods, including guns, cloth, and cash, to Africa. Okay, so leg one is European manufactured goods to Africa. And again, this is guns, cloth, cash. Leg two of triangle trade was known as the Middle Passage because it was the middle of the triangle, and so that was when slaves were transported to the Americas. So, and it is Americas because they were transported to both North and South America and Central America, which technically isn't a continent. And then your third leg was merchants carrying sugar, molasses, cotton, furs, other raw materials from America to Europe. So again, this is sugar, rum, molasses, furs, all these sorts of raw materials that you can get directly from the ground or from an animal. And these were traded at a profit for the European commodities that the merchants would then return to Africa, starting triangular trade all over again. Triangular trade was, for many people, looking strictly from an economic point of view, it was immensely profitable. Merchants grew very, very wealthy. Even though there was a risk of losing ships at sea to pirates or storms, the money to be made was usually outweighed the risks. Certain industries really thrived. So a shipbuilding industry in New England really did well because so many people wanted to ship things. Other colonial industries such as fishing, tobacco, and sugar, they became hugely successful because these goods were so in demand. Thriving trade led to very successful port cities. So port cities are on the coast. So that would be Nantes, France, Bristol, England, Salem, Massachusetts, Newport, Rhode Island. Those were all port cities, and so they would be the havens for a lot of this trade to take place. Even though few slaves were imported directly to the northern cities, the success of the port cities there was made possible by the slave trade. So let's talk about the Middle Passage. The Middle Passage was brutal. The terrible journey began even before the ships set sail. Most Africans were kidnapped from inland villages, and after they were enslaved, they were forced to march in large groups to the local ports. This could be miles. Men, women, and children were bound with ropes and chains. They were usually bound to each other, and they would be forced to walk distances sometimes as long as 1,000 miles. They might be forced to carry heavy loads, and often, often the men's necks were encircled with these thick iron bands, collars, really brutal. You were chained to each other so that if someone fell, they usually took people with them, which would usually incur some type of punishment. And many captives died along the way. Others tried to escape and were usually quickly recaptured and punished. Those who survived the march were then restrained in holding pens and warehouses, much like you might keep animals or items, in shipping ports in Ghana or Senegal, and they were held there until the European traders arrived. And that wasn't even necessarily the most dangerous part of this journey, this forced march. Aboard the ships, they were usually known as floating coffins, because the Africans would, the people who were kidnapped would usually be purchased by Europeans, packed below the decks of slave ships, usually still in their chains, and hundreds of men, women, and children were crammed into a single vessel, and the voyage could last for 3 weeks to 3 months. Okay, so step 1 was them being kidnapped. Step 2 was forced march to the port cities, which could be up to 1,000 miles. That's like forcing you to march from your house to Philadelphia. That's about 1,000 miles. And you're forced to do that in chains, on foot. Then after you make it there, like I said, you're kept in holding pens. And so, again, like animals, until you are purchased by European traders. Now, assuming you were still okay after all of that, like I said, you were purchased, and then you were loaded onto the floating coffin, aka the ship. Now, why were they called floating coffins? Quite frankly, because a lot of them would die, and then you would have a ship full of dead bodies. And they would die for multiple reasons. One, you could have a storm at sea. You could get killed by pirate ships. You could have a failed mutiny by the captives. A mutiny would be a revolt. But mostly it was disease. Because if you're crammed in with a whole bunch of people, I mean, think about it now. We're told to stay away. We're told to isolate. If someone gets sick, crammed into these ships, and when I say crammed, I mean think the size of your twin bed. Okay? Cut it in half, and then put 3 people in it. Fill the ship that way, at least. So then a lot of them are dying of dysentery or smallpox. Some of them died from diseases that they didn't understand, and so they said it looked like no disease at all. Generally speaking, up to half of the Africans on board would die from disease or from the brutal treatment. So starvation, because they're not being fed enough, they're not being given enough water, and they're not, you're so uncomfortable, you're so chained, sometimes there was only room to stand up. You can't sleep properly, so you can't fight off any of the infections. Some enslaved Africans resisted. Others tried to seize control of the ship and return to Africa. But more common than mutiny was suicide. A lot of Africans believed that in death that they would be returned to their home countries. So they would hang themselves, starve themselves, leap overboard and drown. It was a very, very nasty place. So disease, mutiny, suicide, those were all things that could come to you on the ship. Impact of the Atlantic slave trade. So the slave trade brought enormous wealth to merchants and traders, and provided the labor that helped colonial economies grow, which is disgusting when you think about how it happened. The impact on Africa was devastated. African states and societies were torn apart. The lives of individual Africans were cut short, brutalized. They were ripped from their homes, never to return there again. Historians still debate the number of Africans that were directly involved in the slave trade. In the 1500s, they think about 2,000 Africans were sent every year. But by the 1780s, that number continues increasing until they believed it was 80,000 Africans a year were being kidnapped and sent to the slave trade. They believe that over the course of the slave trade, 11 million Africans were sold as slaves in the Americas, and another 2 million died on the Middle Passage. That's a lot of people, okay? And so again, this really is, it's brutal, it's nasty, it's disgusting. And it's a part of our history that should not be forgotten, because it was brutal and we never want anything like that to be happening again, okay? So again, your slave trade, mostly talking about triangular trade, the 3 legs, and then the things in the Middle Passages, in the Middle Passage, and how brutal that was, okay? So again, sorry that today was such a downer, but history is brutal, right? And we can't clean it up because we never want to recreate any of the horrors that have happened in the past, yeah? So I hope you're all staying safe. I hope you're all having a good day. Your Junopod goes with this, so you can work on that. Good luck, and I'll talk to you guys soon. Bye.